So for your information, we will have a two-stage roundtable. The first stage will be presentations from our stakeholders, and the second stage will be question and answers. Thank you, Camille, and thank you, the Red Cross Foundation, for receiving me. It's a great honor for me to contribute to these discussions. And I'm very happy to introduce you to the different speakers that who are attending the round table. We have worked on disasters from a variety of perspectives for a long time. But just as a reminder, social science studies have highly impacted disaster management and disaster risks management, especially in the 1980s, 1990s, where we focused on emerging or identifying rather impactful factors which would increase the potential for natural disasters. This is what we call vulnerability factors, which may have an impact on populations. So the connection between social science research and disaster management is very tight. In 1999 and in 2000, we have started a series of publications, and the United Nations strategy has fully integrated these research studies into their disaster management strategy. So there is a tight bond between the two domains. It's not always a peaceful relationship, but the connection has been made for decades now. Social science is a pretty vast domain of research. However, we always work with or for local stakeholders dealing with emergency situations, disaster, crisis situations, and how they can implement responses and how they can manage disaster impacts in all the dimensions that they cover. We also work on building a risk culture, which would be relevant to real assessments aligned with local priorities and local needs. So we develop resources and tools to make sure that a particular phenomenon would lead to certain impacts on a certain population. Let's give an example of flooding, and bearing in mind flooding impacts on the local population, on the local farming facilities. I'm thinking about Mozambique, for example, where any natural disaster will have a variety of consequences. Displaced people, farming, and livelihood adjustments. So research studies, social science research studies have contributed to improve our knowledge and our identification of risks and risk management strategies. So with Camille, we wanted to highlight the major challenges that are still ongoing, that we are still facing. Research has already shown to what extent emergency situations and disasters lead to getting rid of segmentations and sectorization, getting rid of borders between stakeholders, because in emergency response, we need to be very focused on our expertise, our field of expertise, but also we should be able to work together with other stakeholders. And that means sometimes getting out of our comfort zone and collaborate with ad hoc stakeholders. So these are very particular situations. We need to avoid silos of expertise, bearing in mind that we can't be experts in everything, but we should rather stick to prevention, detection, and all the different stages of risk management and disaster risk management. It's important to have the broad picture in mind. Another important aspect is the governance. When we usually talk to aid professionals worldwide, they had to build up a new domain which did not exist until the 1990s. And natural disaster risk management was seen as a new field of expertise that was directly linked to vulnerability factors and linked to local populations. And what we saw is that vulnerability factors are at the core of our policies, local and governmental policies, political policies, social policies. So it's important now to shift our strategy and to integrate risk management protocols into public policies, not as an optional extra additional subject, but really at the core of public and social policies that would cover that would embrace the broad picture and would cover cross-sectorial aspects of risk management. We are not an ad hoc subject matter anymore. We are at the core of ongoing challenges. And this is something universities should be accountable for. Academics, and Sciences Po is a good example of this. Academics and researchers have to contribute to professional training and nourishing training programs with their academic experiences and their researches to make sure that challenges are faithful to reality. Last but not least, another aspect that was highlighted is the health importance. We need to trigger a cross-sectorial dialogue to make sure that we can interact with different fields, different scientific fields, to make sure that health issues are addressed properly. It's not an easy task. It requires time and energy to build up this dialogue with different fields of expertise. And most of the time, we researchers do not have time to spend trying to understand other scientific fields. And we sometimes think that cross-disciplinary basically means working together and sharing our thoughts, but it's not that simple. We as researchers need to understand the other's perspectives and the other's challenges and constraints as well. Social sciences have worked hard on transforming natural disasters into disasters because they are not natural. And it's a crucial conclusion to bear in mind. So now we need to move on. I mean, we need to use this conclusion to move forward and to better understand their complex structure and how they affect societies and the different populations. So it's really urgent now. Time has come to build connection with other types of science and scientific fields. Thank you, Sandrine. We will ask Jan Verlin to share his thoughts. He's a sociologist and geopolitics of risk chair at the INS institution in Lyon. He worked as the International Center in Sciences Po as well. After studying political sciences in Germany, he graduated in Paris in 2017 with a dedicated work on humanitarian crisis, specifically on gender-based violence and sexual violence in the humanitarian sector, more specifically in emergency response situation. Jan, please, the floor is yours.
Donc, juste effectivement pour présenter ma perspective.
Thank you very much. To share with you my point of view, the starting point of my studies is to better understand situations where crises have multiplied. And this has led to a multiplication of stakeholders as well. And these stakeholders have led to a global and local bureaucracy. And what we call emergency bureaucracy also has led to multiplying layers. In Haiti, for example, Haiti is labeled as an ongoing crisis. And this crisis label has an impact on emergency schemes, which are now fully integrated into a global humanitarian scheme. Most of the time, humanitarian aid is done on a linear basis, starting from donors and funding, moving forward with projects. However, humanitarian development should be based on the actual situation, the actual crisis conditions. We need to rethink how we can build a link with local and national authorities. This is what has led Haiti to be labeled as a country in an ongoing crisis, as a permanent state, a permanent condition. Its crisis has always different faces, different consequences, and we now face a very blurred definition of what a crisis is and what crisis management should be. As a result, professionals of the sector are struggling to find responses, to find accurate solutions. I mentioned the diversification and the massive amount of stakeholders, and they have to deal with a very anchored time scale, which is now seen as permanent. So how we can manage human resources, fundings, communications, project evaluation within this permanent time scale. We know that crisis temporality is different to project temporality. So I try to identify planning tools, forward planning tools, to make sure that we can adjust the time scale in order to make it more aligned with real conditions. So I studied the discrepancies
celle de son évaluation, celle de son
between
financement et celle qu'on trouve dans les rapports avec les dites bénéficiaires et avec le terrain d'action.
what beneficiaries are expecting and what is actually done. I also studied the borders, the limits between the different stakeholders in order to embrace a broader picture and to see the humanitarian sector as a whole.
Souvent oublié entre le projet d'une part et le siège d'autre.
Because we most of the time forget all the intermediate stages between the project that is operated on the local scale and the headquarters, which is deciding what to do.
Comprendre plutôt et se comprendre plutôt comme une partie prenante d'une action publique internationale commune.
In order to make sure that crisis management is fully integrated into a broader scale, a broader strategy. I would like now to give the floor to George, who is a socio-anthropologist. He studied rural.
Il est titulaire d'un doctorat en anthropologie sociale de l'université de Göttingen en Allemagne. Et depuis 2008, il participe à des recherches sur les systèmes agro-pastoraux Peul, avec un accent sur les changements environnementaux et socio-technologiques. Avec le soutien de la Fondation Croix-Rouge, Georges a conduit en 2018 une recherche sur la transition humanitaire.
In 2018, George did work on localizing aid in Benin following the flooding that took place there.
Une localisation aveugle de l'aide.
D'accord, bonsoir.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. My presentation is on the challenges of localizing humanitarian aid following the vulnerabilities in Benin. Let's start off with a little bit of presentation of this area. When we talk about the extreme north of Benin, it is a zone that you can see here on the map. 9,000 square kilometers here, 250,000 people. Let's just look at two municipalities. I'm going to be presenting Karimama. We have two-thirds of its land is a national park. Half of it is in Benin and the other is in Niger. The area in yellow here is occupied by population. This is where all the activity takes place. We have the Niger River running along here. And we can see it's almost systematic over the last 10 years that every year there is violent flooding, which destroys everything around here and really creates a lot of fear. Beyond the flooding, there are other crises as well. We have drought, violent winds, which also destroy houses and agricultural production. We have experimented in recent years. In this area, that's in yellow, there are people living in a buffer zone who should have access to land for agriculture. So it's in this zone here where we have the largest numbers of deaths each year. And most recently, there are more and more jihadist incursions in this area. So this is the multi-crisis situation, a number of different dangers here. Some areas of Karimama you can't get into. If you're on a motorbike, you're going to be knocked off at least twice. There are zones here that are very dangerous, as I've mentioned. Moving on. Look at the vulnerabilities here shown in the image.
C'est l'autre qui vient ravager. Les gens n'ont pas accès, donc, et pas de route d'accès. Les gens, au plan technologique, parfois vous n'arrivez pas à communiquer.
They are lacking in technology, so they find it difficult to communicate as well.
À la gouvernance, au plan institutionnel, tout ça la pose de problème dans cette zone-là. Diapo.
Next slide, please.
Diapo. Ok, donc nous avons initié donc une recherche anthropologique.
So we've carried out anthropological research in the zone. And I'd like to highlight the following points: immersion and direct interaction. I was in the field for 6 months. I really wanted to understand everything that was going on, to find out about the configuration of this humanitarian aid that was taking place in this region, where every year you have the impression that every year, every day of the year, the drama is just getting worse and worse. So this was participative observation for a long period. Following the floods, I organized discussions with the local communities, and I spoke to a number of different stakeholders to find out exactly what was going on.
Voilà. Donc, non, oui, voilà, merci. Donc, en termes donc de résultats, l'un des éléments.
So concerning the results, one of the important areas that I really wanted to draw your attention to is the following. There is humanitarian measures in place, quite considerable already, but you have to realize that this institutional mechanism which is in place has a certain preeminence. You have a contingency plan in place given to the mayor or the local chiefs who are charged, therefore, with putting in place the reaction response.
Ces acteurs-là constituent donc des acteurs majeurs. Donc, ils détiennent donc le leadership donc, de l'aide dans ce milieu-là et par conséquent soumettent tous les autres acteurs, quelle que soit donc leur importance. L'autre élément, c'est qu'au-delà donc des acteurs administratifs, politico-administratifs,
beyond the political and administrative actors, we have the NGOs,
qui ont la capacité de mobiliser, donc de
and they have the capacity to mobilize aid on an international level.
Des ressources à déployer donc à l'échelle locale, mais qui aussi vont reposer leurs actions sur les ONG locales. Quelques ONG locales. Il faut dire que le Bénin n'était pas connu comme un pays.
Benin was not known as a country where there were humanitarian NGOs, because we hadn't known major crises in the past. The first NGOs who were seen was following the structural program put in place. That was in the 1980s, 1990s. So the NGOs who emerged in that area were mainly looking at development as opposed to humanitarian NGOs.
Ou qui requalifient donc leurs objets en devenant des ONG humanitaires ou en se fiant donc à quelques financements venant donc des pays du Golfe pour réclamer donc une certaine expertise humanitaire, ce qui n'est réellement pas ce qui n'est pas vrai. Donc si on doit s'en tenir donc au principe humanitaire. Un autre élément central donc
another key element in our work is the following. Even in this crisis situation, where people are continually subjected to different disasters and dramas, the populations are not resigned. You get the impression that these people will always resist to these conditions, and they will always bounce back to recreate their environment following the disaster. So having the assistance is important for creativity and innovation, but you have to say that first and foremost, assistance gives them the direct response that they need, but that's not necessarily what they need on a long-term scale.
Dans l'immédiat et dans l'absolu, dans l'urgence, elle contribue énormément à répondre donc aux besoins des communautés. Et comme je l'ai dit, la créativité, l'innovation.
As I said, creativity and innovation, it could be concerning agriculture. And this is after the flooding. And sometimes people say that the agriculture is more productive following the flooding. A lot of men and women who are working harder post-flood.
Vous avez par exemple le transport fluvial qui sera développé en utilisant donc la période donc de crue comme une opportunité. Donc tous ces éléments-là
So all these elements contribute to resilience.
Un autre élément important, c'est
Another important element
finalement un outil de
is using this assistant as a way to make social and political claims.
Saisir les opportunités d'aide pour réclamer donc auprès donc des décideurs ceux qui conçoivent, ils voient comme n'étant pas proches donc de leurs besoins, n'étant pas ne respectant pas leur engagement, et donc c'est un outil donc de renégociation du contrat social au niveau local. Slide. Donc voilà, et en termes donc de
In terms of the localization of humanitarian aid, we saw that international aid was more preferred. Unlike that's what we hear on a political level.
Jouent les premiers rôles, vous avez l'impression que au regard donc des enjeux politiques, des enjeux territoriaux, claniques, dans le milieu, les communautés préfèrent une aide qui vient directement des ONG internationales plutôt que des ONG locales parce que elles perçoivent par exemple que l'aide venant donc de ces
What
ONG
happening
locales
is
soit apolitique, soit
local aid is often seen as politically biased, whereas international aid is seen as unbiased. So this localization shift is not always visible in our findings. It could, localizing aid could lead to a conflict of power and to redistribute power within communities or from one community to another or between people. Even though international NGOs have improved local NGOs' capacities, we locally should not depend on funding schemes. This is why I considered multi-layered funding schemes in order to use a variety of funding tools and not to depend on one specific protocol. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, George, for focusing on aid localization. We are inviting Annabelle Moati to join us. She's a geographer. She graduated in her PhD. She completed her PhD recently, and she was the winner of our foundation grant in 2020. And she studied more specifically the Irma phenomenon in Saint-Martin Island. Thank you, Camille. I first would like to thank you, Croix-Rouge Foundation, for the grant.
I am a geographer, that's right. And unlike what has already been said today, a lot of things have been said about disaster response and little about the prevention itself. We can see that from a point of view, from a scientific point of view, work done on post-disaster reconstruction is not as much as concerning crisis management. So we have this conjunction of a lot of money which is invested from international and local stakeholders, but very little research is done to study and understand and analyze post-disaster situations. And it was in 2011 that I did my thesis.
L'Indonésie, le Japon, mais aussi la France métropolitaine.
Indonesia, Japan, and mainland France, the objective was the following: to understand and analyze post-disaster reconstruction, and to find elements that are common in all of these different areas, and also those that are specific to individual territories and countries. The work was done in Japan and Indonesia, but what I'm going to present here is the work that was done following the cyclone Irma in St. Martin in the Caribbean. I'm just talking about St. Martin. I'm not talking about St. Barthélemy, even though it is a French island that was impacted by cyclone or hurricane Irma. So I will just be talking to you about St. Martin.
La comparaison aurait cependant été très intéressante.
It would have been interesting to compare the two, but the cost of living was too much in St. Bart. So, post-disaster reconstruction, as was said this morning by Mr. Mattei, is a universal phenomenon. This is not a question of survival, but it's revival after the disaster. There are a number of different phases.
Une attente, un espoir, celui de se relever moins vulnérable et plus résilient.
People want to come back stronger. That's a common theme all over the world. It's quite intuitive. When we live and undergo trauma, we want to come back and improve, especially what made us vulnerable before, to prepare for future difficulties. So this hope led to an international injunction by the UN, and that's the Build Back Better initiative. Build Back Better was based on three key pillars. The first is reducing the exposure to the threats. We can also talk about reducing physical vulnerability, that's to say, to build constructions that are parasismic or paracyclonic. The second one is reducing organizational vulnerability, that was said by Sandrine just earlier. When we're in a post-disaster situation, restructuring governance is necessary. Everyone needs to get around the table and take collective decisions to help the society get back on its feet. So this organizational restructuration is different to before. And this is where the ministers come together. In France, the objective of this is to be able to quickly respond to those affected. And of course, to spend public money. In France, there's a whole number of laws and procedural rules that mean that when we spend public money, certain criteria has to be respected, first and foremost. So when we blur the lines between ministries, it enables us to take quicker decisions when they come around the table. The third pillar, as you've understood, is communities getting back on their feet, enabling them to revive. There are different forms of solidarity. It could be local, interpersonal, intercommunitary, but also national solidarity as well. In France, we have our system called the CatNat system. It's a form of solidarity. It's national solidarity in the form of appeal. This can be national, it can be international as well. The World Bank has their reconstruction funds as well. This Build Back Better is all about being more resilient. And this is clearly tangible. But how is it put in place? Well, it's all about the time scale of the process. Reconstruction takes place between two extremes. There's a lot of things to do right at the beginning, a lot of decisions to be made in a place where their resources have been affected and access is limited. And then as time goes by, several years later, at the end of the process, we realize that the decisions that are being taken to rebuild a bridge or a dam, for example, they were done during the post-disaster phase.
Pour rentrer maintenant plus précisément dans la question de Saint-Martin et de l'ouragan Irma,
let's look at Hurricane Irma in St. Martin in 2016. So this was a Category 5 hurricane, and the eye of the hurricane hit an island of 90 square kilometers. That really is so unlucky that the eye of a cyclone exactly of that size hit an island of the same size. A huge impact on the island, way beyond the capacities of the population. And they were completely overwhelmed in Saint Martin. Several characteristics on the island. Number one, it's very small. It's an island, and it's separated into two states. The north of Saint Martin is French overseas department or territory, and the North Saint Martin is a territory of the Netherlands. So we've got two administrative and political structures which are completely different. That creates problems for cooperation. It could be for economic development, immigration, political choices as well. And it's difficult to bring the two together. We have a clear fracture between the two zones. This is the area of France with the greatest diversity of nationalities. Between 120 and 140 different nationalities present on the island. But we have very community-based relationships. People live in their community. It could be cultural or economic. And that is clearly noticeable. People don't know others in a different area, different district. They don't know their ways of subsistence, their revenue. So it's a lifestyle where people really live in enclaves of their own districts. So there's not enough administration, on one hand by the French government, but also by the local authorities. When I say under-administrated, I say that the French administration has simply turned its eyes away and turned its back. And it had to wait until Irma before they took notice. Locally, the local authorities have a large proportion of executives who are incapable of write or read French correctly because of their nationalities. It makes it difficult to apply the French laws to the people of Saint Martin. Saint-Martin. So when Hurricane Irma arrived, there were considerable impacts, Category 5, 350 kilometers per hour, the gusts of wind. This required huge investments. A number of solidarity mechanisms were put in place, enabling us to reduce vulnerabilities in the future. Today, this may be temporary or permanent, but it will require for Saint Martin a number of years to continue to monitor the situation before coming to any kind of conclusion. That's the same observation for the island itself. The French government has put in place a risk contingency plans to prepare the island for future events. It's turned out that these meetings were organized without any consultation with the local powers, local authorities, which is a huge flaw. And there was considerable opposition to this plan, which arose because of the lack of consultation. People need to get back to good conditions, electricity, water, a roof over their heads. So we had this slow administrative reaction. And the reaction post-disaster was not efficient at all. Can we see this as an opportunity on how to put in place preventative measures? Well, as I said, it's too early to see, but this is 5 or 6 years after the catastrophe, and it is still too early to tell. It's a question of putting in place monitoring on long-term reconstruction. That's what we're putting in place with a number of colleagues with our action plan. Thank you very much for listening. Many thanks, Annabelle, for having underline the importance of reconstruction. I'm now going to hand over to Omar. And for those who don't speak English, you can listen to the translation, which will be into French. Simply connect to the Zoom conference. Omar he's director of the American Red Cross, where he works in close collaboration with local units. He's putting in place programs and initiatives connected to preparedness and the management of disasters. He also manages the World Center of Preparedness for Disasters, called the GDPC. Omar, over to you.
Thank you, Camille, and apologies to those in the room who hear my English instead of the elegant French. I have enjoyed, and I really appreciate the opportunity to go last amongst this esteemed panel, because my contributions, I think, actually touch upon a number of pieces that have already been shared. So the Global Disaster Preparedness Center is a IFRC reference center hosted by the American Red Cross with a mandate to provide technical assistance, support knowledge management and research, and to drive innovation in areas that are relevant to the national societies and the practitioners that are focusing in these areas. While we particularly serve Red Cross, Red Crescent practitioners, we really try to offer research that complements practice that's relevant to any organization. And in this way, we've really tried to expand the evidence base so that it can help us. We can use the evidence as a tool to push these ideas forward. And then earlier today, Virginie mentioned the different types of ways that we can do that. For example, we have Prepare Center, which is a knowledge management platform. And during COVID-19 epidemic, we were able to share resources from across the network and let people really leverage the tools that were being developed by others, but in a really systematic way to accelerate. We've done this as well for migration displacement with the Humanitarian Service Points Toolkit. We've also, elevated innovations in disaster risk reduction around nature-based solutions and other places to make them available across languages and across a number of different, let's say, borders. So I'd like today to outline 3 areas where research has been essential to enhance our view on effective programs, impact, and relevance, while also helping us to communicate how to adjust to change. Impacts from climate change, economic and political fragility, and an evolving funding landscape have required significant adjustment in the past decade. First, in the area of community disaster preparedness, we know that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of programs and approaches that have been implemented globally to help communities safeguard themselves from hazards. For the Red Cross and Red Crescent, investments and support are made with communities to increase their understanding and knowledge of risk, to be connected and enable self-organization and let them to take and encourage them to take action. The Red Cross uses these participatory approaches to ensure risk analyses are performed and community needs are identified. Priorities can include disaster readiness activities, community early warning systems, disaster risk reduction, risk mitigation activities, etc. Now, how long does this practice take? What does it cost? Can we identify the most important aspects to enable a greater reach? How do we achieve replication and scale? What are the ways that communities can self-organize in a way that external resources can be focused on communities who have less? And then how can we achieve localization? What are the things that we aren't thinking about as we approach these problems? In 2020, we looked at nearly 50 of these community programs, and we asked these questions. We identified a few common themes that surprised us. First, despite it being in our DNA, doing a full context analysis at the community level is often skipped in favor of a combination of experience and a sense of urgency. We gotta get the project done. We can skip that. We already know what's going on here. And habit is basically replacing rigor. This is a breakdown, especially in the world where it's facing so much change. A limited understanding of the local context can lead to mistakes, including missing vulnerable groups or worse, miscategorizing the risk profile. This discussion about vulnerability factors they're evolving. And so really understanding how they're linked to social policies and other places is critical. A combination of local knowledge, data, and participatory engagement to help build common understanding at the community level is essential. Communities, while generally connected, are not always inclusive. We have increasing responsibility to help communities to understand how they can improve their care for the marginalized and most vulnerable. I think the examples from St. Martin underscore that. Often communities will share their challenges and identify solutions that were never conceived before. This leads to innovation and opportunities for better change. And not to mince words, but climate change is complicating things. Repeating risk analyses, exercising approaches, and investing in the resilience of a community's needs to be part of a long-term strategy, involving government partners, civil society organizations, and businesses that can also lead to sustainability. We know we need to evolve how we work. The introduction of systemizing anticipatory action, for instance, is changing the funding context. It's introducing a construct that allows for resources to be put in place in advance of disasters to release to the community and in hopes to avoid disasters. As population centers grow, the grassroots approach for community preparedness has evolved. We are now looking at complex systems, which when challenged by shocks, respond entirely differently than rural communities. When it comes to urban resilience, our participatory approaches have been challenged, and we are challenged by the idea that we should be prioritizing vulnerability in cities. So in fact, one large challenge is to help the community members see themselves as a stakeholder in a city by creating a space for city agencies, ministries, vulnerable groups, and representatives of the private sector and other citizens to come together. A recognition of their common interests and priorities can emerge, allowing for co-design. Again, this has emerged in some of the discussions today. We need to also think about the expanded stakeholders in an urban environment and consider existing systems which are already in place to achieve many important aspects of disaster risk reduction, waste management, access to water, public transportation systems, food systems. The way these operate in a city is entirely more sophisticated than in an urban environment. Cities, So jump ahead to innovation. I can't read my handwriting, sorry. Innovation and technology. The GDPC has realized that the global mandate, with a global mandate to support national societies, we need to leverage the tools that we have access to. Technology, for example, can be an effective tool for scale. The increasing access to internet, the proliferation of smartphones, and now transformative innovations such as the generative AI have challenged humanitarians to think how to leverage the technology in their programs to benefit communities. Our research shows that it's best to start at the community level instead of starting with the technology. In fact, technology designed without input from the community is rarely fit for purpose. And despite best intention, it's often discarded, ignored, or worse, left to the graveyard of unused and often high potential tools. The steps for introducing technology to support humanitarian practices are simple. Start with the community. Understand from the community what challenges or problems they have, and co-design a solution path that can yield to enhanced results. Bringing the tech creator to the community to understand directly the context, the reality, if you will, of using that technology, and describe success to the developer, not as a completion of the project, but as an impact on the community. If developing a tool to be used to help communities better organize, if you're designing a tool to help a community better organize, then the tool should achieve some clear objectives, not just pass a quality assurance test. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Omar. Donc, la suite, Sandrine, je vous laisse la parole.
Thank you very much, Omar. I think I can give the floor to Sandrine now for you to ask our speakers some tricky questions or interesting questions. Thank you all for sharing your insights. And we are very happy to see how this crisis management cycle can be completed from one stage to another based on your contributions. Actually wanted to trigger some interaction among you guys, and will give you the leeway to choose which question you want to answer. We have already mentioned questions that make the link between Yann and George or Yann and Annabelle. The first being the overinvestment in some territories. Annabelle described it very brilliantly when it comes to Saint-Martin Island. But what she didn't say, but mentioned, is that another hurricane happened at the same time. And not only Irma, but also technology activity and research activity. And it happened in Saint-Martin, but it's the same in Haiti, which is described as a permanent crisis territory. As Yann explained, the temporality between emergency response and development work is always tricky. And I personally have some reservations when it comes to this over-investing territories in particular situations. When a disaster happens, sometimes some regions receive extra investment, extra activity, and it can lead to difficulties in managing and coordinating all these stakeholders. There's a risk of saturation, basically, or overwhelming the zone. And I think this is visible in the research field as well as in the humanitarian sector. And my second question is based on Yann's and George's findings, and maybe on Omar's conclusions as well. How can we articulate crisis management with the long-term temporality, with a long-term visibility? How can we learn the lessons from Saint-Martin episode happening in 2017, which triggered a whole lot of investment and efforts? What lessons can be learned 6-7 years from then? I think it would be relevant to read the conclusions now, to reach some outcomes now, 6 to 7 years later, because that's probably where the after effects are visible. How can we articulate the short-term crisis management with long-term analysis and long-term evaluations? I have so many other questions to ask, but I'll just give you some opportunities to explain more. Annabelle, for example, you also mentioned decision-making tools. Can you elaborate on this? You mentioned cross-disciplinary work. And I would like to know what methodologies do you implement? That was for Annabelle. As far as George is concerned, I wanted to get back to your outsider view, point of view on localizing aid, because you clearly insisted on the fact that localizing assistance and fundings should not be done blindly, and it's not an easy task to localize aid when international standards are still authoritarian. So I wanted to get back to your personal experience and how you made your voice heard on this localization issue. And the last question is addressed to all of you. How you consider the materiality of your topics, whether you work on earthquake, flooding, hurricane. I mean, the material dimension is completely different from one phenomenon to another. So how do you embrace this materiality, this physical impact in your research? Because we, as academics, we tend to speak of natural disasters as a whole in a very global and abstract concept. But should we adjust our research studies and our operations depending on the type of phenomenon? So this is the whole list of questions I wanted to share with you. Please feel free to answer whatever you want.
Maybe Annabelle, you'd like to start off by answering. Lots of questions in there. We'll need a few 4 or 5 hours to answer that, I think. So concerning the financing, first and foremost, I think Yan's experience in Haiti will be very complementary to what I have in St. Martin. It's true, we did see 4 research consortiums. Not on all of the island, but just on the French part of the island. And it was very delicate, it was complicated. It did raise ethical questions from the researchers. Because the first teams arrived just a few months after the catastrophe, after the disaster, just 2 months, in fact, after the hurricane. So the disaster reconstructions that I've studied was often 5, 10, 15, 20 years after the event itself, and not 2 months. We do have our methods that go back to the 70s. It's not a question of methodology, it's just a question of protocol, and we have that in place. The essential point was reconnecting people with accessibility to the standard conditions of water, electricity, etc. What were the consequences of the decisions taken? Well, I don't think it was the best time to come in, as far as we were concerned. What did it generate? Considerable expectations from the stakeholders on the island, that's for sure. They saw all of a sudden 60 or 80 researchers suddenly on their island. That's a lot of people. And there was considerable expectations looking forward to our results. So there was a mix between people who we didn't know whether they were technicians or experts or researchers. Their roles were not clear enough, I think. So it did create major issues. And with other colleagues, we're trying to find ways. And if you'd like to participate, Please do. So that we're creating a post-disaster research charter. For the interdisciplinary aspects, a couple of words. It's not easy. I am here in Paris, but I am a geographer, more literary based, I think, in my research. And I joined this team and I worked for 1 year in Mayotte. Questions were raised concerning vocabulary. Just the term conservative, my idea of the term conservative was not necessarily the same as other people. I didn't see that as a positive word, conservative, but those other people with whom I was working, they saw the term conservative was the opposite. One of us thought it was positive and the other thought it was negative. So that just gives you an idea of the different interpretations of the term conservative. People don't have the same interpretation of the language that is being used. That does require a lot of work and energy to solve problems like that. But coming together creates a synergy. Moving on to the other question, Sandrine. We recently developed with two interdisciplinary teams games. These are not board games, they're serious games. The objective being to help people in the field to use scientific tools. It's a game destined for kids aged 14, 15 in the Caribbean. The name of the game was Hurricane game. A game to teach children just how to manage that post-disaster period. It was an awareness-raising program, and with our colleagues, we developed a second game called Simmana. And this is for adults, municipal workers who are playing other roles. So nobody was playing their own role, to give people the idea of what it's like to be in the shoes of somebody else in the humanitarian chain. And these games really do work. We're currently working on assessment tools. But the first feedback that we've had is that there's a good way of accelerating exchange dialogues. In just an hour and a half of game, they answered questions that took them more than 10 or 20 municipal meetings. That was as far as the adult serious game was concerned. I'm going to stop there on my answer. I'll let my other comrades to intervene as well. We've got just less than 15 minutes. So it could be interesting to reach our conclusions now. So this question of overinvestment.
S'explique par un surinvestissement. Donc, ce qui rend la chose un peu compliquée pour moi. Parce que longtemps avant, pas si longtemps, en 2009.
In 2009, when I started my thesis, I was working on two countries, and it was Haiti. This was Nicaragua and Mexico. Looking at the reconstruction of these two countries. And back then, 2010, we had the earthquake in Haiti. I was invited with a grant to reorientate my thesis with this in mind. And this has led me to where I am today. So overinvestment has taken me where I am. So I am a little skeptic. Why am I skeptic? Well, I can see, and I've seen this in Haiti, that what happens on a research level is really connected to what is happening in the professional world. That's why the question is very important, because it brings together what we see in the two fields. I saw this in Haiti. I'm sure it was the same in Saint Martin as well. There's a sectorial response. When I was in Haiti, in this post-earthquake area, I saw in 2011, during the cholera period, lots of people who were working in health. They weren't there before. That was the same in 2016 after the hurricane. So different profiles arrive depending on the impact of the event. So there's a whole waves of different specialists who would come onto the island. Different professionals, which after each disaster, they would arrive wave after wave. So we had this rivalry that appeared as a consequence. The same dynamic that we saw working in humanitarian actors, I saw it on a daily basis. When I arrived for the first time in Port-au-Prince, I started off in a rural area, first and foremost, and a few months later, I joined the capital, and I think I joined a little bit too late. There was nowhere to live. I found it impossible for me to find anywhere to live. My objective was not to live in a hotel room for months. So in the end, I found an apartment, which was suggested. There was an American researcher who suggested it to me. The door opened, and there was a Belgian person who said, "Oh no, not another one. No, there are too many of us here." So we could see this competition was there straight away. The same challenges. And this lack of organization, this lack of accommodation affected everybody, including the researchers and humanitarian actors. So it's a question of the place and space that we occupy. I like the English term, placing. This notion of placing is all about finding one's place, but it also means replacing somebody else. So we need to think about the impact that we that we have on the field and the space that we take when we arrive in great numbers. This could be Haiti or St. Martin. C'est aussi très problématique de découvrir chaque fois de nouveau un terrain qui auparavant souvent un terrain considéré comme périphérique, non pertinent, et qui tout d'un coup est au centre. Et donc, all of a sudden, these places are at the center of everyone's attention, so lots and lots of people all arrive at the same time. Je vais peut-être reprendre juste un autre élément qui est la question. There's another element that you mentioned, which is materiality. Parce que je me trouve de nouveau au miroir des acteurs professionnels, parce que moi je me rends compte en la répondant, j'ai aussi adopté une I also have adopted an all-hazards approach. I try to abstract phenomena of disasters in order to better understand the management tools that are applied, often indiscriminately. It could the same things regardless of the disaster. And I saw that often the solution comes by the back door. And I noticed in Haiti that the localization of the disaster will vary clearly. There's a big difference between a drought that covers a large area and droughts that cover small areas. So this basically means that you shouldn't be using the same procedures for different disasters. So every time it was necessary to find the right stakeholders in these different localizations. We had to move them. We had to adapt our approach to the type of disaster to find out how it was being managed. So there's kind of generalization, overgeneralization, I think. And this comes back time after time. Many thanks, Yann. We don't have much time. Over to Georges. The first one is about over-investment, as I said in my presentation. I haven't worked in an over-invested zone. This hasn't been my experience. Benin is a new area because it's not used to having humanitarian actions. We don't have a lot of specialized local structures. So that's the case for our country.
actions, les gens vont changer de titre, des dénominations qui naissent et qui pleuvent dans la région. Donc, on peut observer dans ces phénomènes-là.
You can observe this phenomenon now these days. So there are some NGOs that do intervene, but still in our country, it's still not major because it is relatively new. The other element or question was concerning the time frame. What we see as a continuity of emergency and post-disaster development. This is what we do, but I think we need greater effort in the emergency phase. It's good though, everybody wants to learn how things are done. And then when the flood comes, people are ready, which proves that we need to have the resources upstream and the skills upstream in order to put in place the right actions at the right time. So we have seen this adaptation, this improvement over time. And finally, the question about localization of aid. It's obvious that this can't be done in the places where I work. It's just too complex. Given what's happened in the past, political antecedents, the tribal challenges that are in place in our country, I can say that sometimes you could try and apply your norms and your standards internationally, but in the field, sometimes you'll be surprised it's simply not possible because you have political propaganda or fake news, which is going to put a spanner in the works. People are therefore obliged to believe in neutral, in assistance which is neutral, and it's difficult to convince people of this. It's not easy to get them to be neutral when you have these conflicting messages coming from the humanitarian actors and from the local politicians as well.
Omar?
I'll try to be brief. I have a few comments, and just maybe starting with investment, taking a humanitarian perspective rather than an academic perspective. I actually think that we're way underinvested when it comes to disaster risk reduction, for instance. Then the investment in disaster risk reduction continues to drop year on and year out, despite the increasing need for preventative actions to be taken by communities, by governments, etc. And instead, what we've done is, and we have, to the materiality question, we've taken a people-centered, all-hazard approach in our work. That is essential to how we operate, but we have a tendency to still silo that work within the sectors, maybe geographically, maybe even during different stages of the disaster management cycle. And that, I think, is something that we need to reflect on, because increasingly, these are all interrelated. The things we're doing are all interrelated, and we need to be thinking from preparedness, through local actions that are taken, all the way through the readiness actions that need to be done to prepare for a hazard, and then if it comes to disaster response, to be able to take effective action, essentially, in repeating that investment in preparedness. So for me, it's the questions, while definitely trigger a lot of responses in this. Annette said we could probably spend the whole afternoon digging into them. I think that there's ultimately an important opportunity to think about how the evidence that's collected in research is really put into practice, and the way that this work is sort of prioritized, the way questions are identified in partnership with humanitarian actors to better make them more relevant to the use of the challenges that are facing them, I think is really important. The example, just this perspective on localization in Benin, to me, is profound, and it's really important. How do we take that forward into the way that we're prioritizing localization in all of our work from a humanitarian perspective? Because there are decisions that we have to make every day in order to make sure that the resources that we have that are limited are properly, spread out in order for us to achieve what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omar. Do we have any question coming from the audience, the assembly, or maybe online questions? We have a few minutes left. Yes, we do have a question for Yann. Is emergency, humanitarian emergency that is experienced on the African continent, is it the same as the one experienced in Haiti? Well, it's a very tricky question, comparing cases, comparing phenomena, and how, to what extent we can move to an abstract concept. My personal answer to this question would be we can't compare situations. We can't experience the same emergency needs from one continent to another. All territories are linked to their historical background, more specifically the colonization background, which is clearly different from Haiti, between Haiti and African continent. And also the difference lies in the tools that are used. The question of standardizing tools and instruments is quite delicate, because I understand the need for standardizing, but it's really important to have a relevant adaptation and adjustment process. We need to adjust to the local population, but also to the disaster. And we need to bear in mind climate change. And that's why this localizing aspect is very tricky. It's very complex, because it's always a very fine balance between standardizing and localizing. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts and for sharing your expertise. It was a great pleasure to listen to all your stories and experiences from this broad geographical approach. I don't have any specific conclusion to bring now, but I think we get the opportunity to share a drink together now. So I think this will be the best conclusion to bring to this day full of discussions. Thank you all for joining us.